last month in March, we did a session on ephemeral art. And mostly the focus was how do we create an environment where ephemeral art, where temporary installations are truly part of the conversation on an ongoing basis. And Jason Turgeon, who is here tonight, who heads up Figment over there, was one of the key presenters talking about Figment, and also with Mark Mattel, who's also here talking about the Bartlett Yards project up in Roxbury. So this one is an effort to look at the intersection of urban design and art in public places. What has happened? The panel will talk about work that they have done. We'll talk about new strategies that have evolved out of the work that they have done. And what I'm hoping, and as you'll see on the agenda, the last part of this evening is really going to be given over, I hope, and maybe even more than just the last part, to two questions. What have we learned tonight? And more important than that is, what are we going to do about it? And that is hugely important, because I think every single person in this room has responsibilities, given the fact that this is where they work, this is the arena within which they work. The next step is, how do I maneuver myself in that arena, and with whom do I maneuver myself, so that ultimately what we have in Boston and in the region is a much more vibrant, much more robust, much more sustainable environment for public art. And I want to say too about that real fast. Somebody who's a hell of a lot smarter than I am said that, this is Robert Irwin, all art by definition is public. But art in public places is different. You have three components. You have the art, you have the public, and you have the place. And the way in which those three interact is really what is the most compelling and is the most critical in coming up with something that everyone can engage in and everyone can really say, you know what, this is a value. The panel we have tonight is pretty amazing. Not pretty amazing, it is amazing. We have Margie Lackner and Catherine Knowlton, both from the MBTA. We have Rob Trumbore from Wentworth Institute, also head of a practice, public art practice called Art Forming, or Art in Public Places, I should say. And then finally, David Feldman, who is a very close associate of Janet Eckelman's, to talk about her work. And I do want to apologize on behalf of Chris Cook, head of the Mayor's Office of Arts, Culture, and Tourism here in Boston. He has been, as you might imagine, otherwise occupied since Monday, and had to bow out. So I'm going to hand it over to Margie and to Catherine, and go from there, and then so that people will really feel free to just raise your hand. This is not a lecture, however much it may be set up like that. This is really designed to be a conversation, and even more than that, a productive conversation, so that when we walk out of here tonight, there will be new ideas that are running around in our heads. Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Margie Lackner. Can you hear me? No. Nope, okay. Margie Lackner from the MBTA. I'm the Director of Design and Architecture. And this is Catherine Knowlton, who's the Manager for Graphics and Art at the MBTA also. We're usually on the other side of the table, so I'm not a practice presenter, so please bear with me. Our work is very highly technical, and it's very much in service of an operating. Funding, which we unfortunately no longer have. That's what made a lot of things possible. We brought catalogs with us, and we hope that everybody has one. There's something like 90 pieces in the collection at this point. And I hope that you're able to sometime take an art tour of the MBTA. John I. Williams, Karen Arpino, Barbara Boylan, before me were all very much involved from the side of the MBTA, in these programs. The MBTA does believe that transportation excellence includes every element in the system and should enhance the experience of travel by acknowledging the humanity of our customers. As multiple modes of transportation become more integral to our thinking about how we make spaces for people to travel, design must be part of that. Community surrounding funding future facilities will participate, in any selection process going forward. After the 1% for art, stopped being in place, I think even by legislation, I'm not really sure. There are others, probably Chris Cook would know more about that if he were here. We were then able to get some money budgeted for art, and I'm going to let Catherine describe, because she was there. I've been at the T for 10 years, and some of these pieces were going on when I started there. There was also some beautiful pieces at Airport Station, and where else, Catherine?
Just basically, just to get back to that really quickly, in regards to budgeting for the art, it was always part of a project. It was, we applied through the FTA, through these, various pieces, and this was how the artwork was, garnered and acquired. But in terms of the pieces, Airport Station, definitely this one piece, that was the one, I think the last piece that I saw, I came kind of at the end of it as well. So, from that point on, we've been doing different types of ways to bring artwork to the stations.
Then that money was pulled. It actually selected artists for the Charles MGH station, and there was a selection process in place for the Government Center station, but the money was pulled because the whole system is in such desperate condition that it was felt at the time that spending money for art when we didn't have enough trains and the bridges were falling down, and I'm talking literally, that would not be perceived well by the public. So we then moved to artwork that is very much sponsored by the general manager and the Secretary of Transportation. It's primarily community-based. Various organizations in the community come to the MBTA and have led to programs at Jackson Square, Davis Square. We'll have one coming forward, Urbano Project, which empowers urban youth to create social change through art and performance. Catherine's worked on a number of these pieces, including a recent piece at Alewife.
The youth projects are always led by usually an institution of some kind. So Alewife was led through an after-school program. They came to us. They had the idea of what to do. They didn't have a location yet. That's where we came in. But in terms of the actual project payments, everything was through them. They paid for the entire piece, everything. So in terms of the Jackson Square project, which was a 4-year project with youth at a very troubled station at the time, lots of violence, lots of community groups wanting to see a change, brought in some of these kids who, some of them actually were part of the problem, actually, and they turned out for the best. And there was a lot of studies done based on that project because it showed there was a no violence campaign happening that was working.
So, here we are now. Time has passed, and a lot of the pieces that were part of the Red Line Extension program are falling apart, literally. We had a piece of the Hadzi sculpture in Harvard Square, the upper left hand, literally come crashing to the ground. Fortunately, nobody was injured. There are a couple more pieces that are in danger of falling. We need to paint. We've inspected that we need to paint the Gift of the Wind at Porter Square. We're going to start the second restoration of the bench at Alewife. We still are looking for people to help us to get funding to fix the piece by Kepish at Harvard Square Station. We were able to form a partnership with the concert department at MIT to get repairs done to the Kendall Band, which involves having the students trained in getting out on the track. We have to shut down power. Work has to be done at night. Dealing with these things is very complicated. So obviously continuing to look for partnerships and engaging community in relifing some of these things. Now, how do I get to the next one, Catherine? There. Need to go down. Okay. So what we're looking at now, what we've been able to do now is we're trying to get, to make sure that the architecture itself has as artful an approach as possible. And we know that architects and engineers may think that they can do art, but that's not always the case. We're able to do some enhancements to the Columbia Road Bridge on the upper left. And we were recently able to engage Artists for Humanities in doing designs for the panels on the park side of Assembly Station. On the upper right is a project that I worked with Sheila LeBrant de Bretteville at the Central Artery Tunnel Project and their Art in Public Places program there, where echoes of the West End neighborhood were literally cast into the bridge abutment. In terms of integral art, we really have to follow FTA standards because almost all of our projects are funded by Federal Transit Authority. And quality is really the most important aspect in making selections. Craftsmanship, maintenance. We need to do open, fair and open process for all work. Have clear contracts, with the artists. And the integral art concept is one that I learned while working at the Artery, to use the materials that already exist, so that, for example, if you have to have a fence, have an artist design the fence. If you have a ceiling, have an artist design the ceiling. To engage the artist, in using the materials that we have to have anyhow. If you have a concrete abutment, have the artist design the form liner, for the concrete abutment. That way we're not as likely to have pieces of sculpture fall down or have things that have more onerous maintenance requirements than what we already have to do, because it's really hard enough for us to do that as possible. So what we've started to do now is I've been working to support the Green Line Extension program, and have drafted a policy for permanent art there. The community is extremely interested in having art along the Green Line Extension, and there are lots of opportunities for it. Deborah Fennick back there is involved with it, and she's helping to identify opportunities so that we can get really great things to happen. We've been able to bring Lenny, excuse my pronunciation, Lenny Swindiger in to do light art, because we have things like some of what we do is not as glamorous as others in this room get to do, but we need under-bridge lighting, under viaduct lighting, and why not have it be wonderful? For example, at Leechmere Station. We're looking right now, and we have some support from the Secretary of Transportation to do lighting of the South Station head houses, illustrated up there, on the upper left and lower right. And in terms of partnership again, the Cable Stay Bridge is something that I worked on also, and with Jamie Carpenter, and where he did do a crenellated design of the sort of a pyramidal design of the ring that's the false abutment wall and the portal, and then the design for the lighting there. And Miguel Rosales, who was involved in the design of the bridge, has actually put personal money as well as lots of personal time in there to make sure that the lighting is maintained. So that's it. Hope I haven't said too much.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions, but I think what I'd like to do is hold off. And one of them just to think about is partnerships. I'm thinking about partnerships and also the youth groups, which are fascinating. But what I'd like to do is ask Rob.
I'm just going to switch over for a minute.
Okay. Yeah. Oh. All right. Well, I can tell a few jokes. Actually, while he's doing the switchover, why don't I ask Margie, if I could, about the issue of partnerships allied with the youth groups that you were describing, particularly around the Jackson Square project. how much life is there in that? How much longevity is there in that? What kinds of creative approaches, is the T capable of engaging in terms of those kinds of partnerships?
We don't go out looking for more work.
I meant it in the best possible way.
Oh no, I know that, and I will get there to the best possible way. But because obviously positions have to be funded, because art is enormously time-consuming and dealing with everything and every person. People come to us, and so when there is a community group that has an interest, they come to us.
This was a great segue into something else that I'll talk about later, having to do with some of the local neighborhood groups and the local CDCs, and some opportunities that seem to be emerging out of that. And I think Jason and Mark can probably talk a lot about that right now. But instead, I'm going to give it over to Rob.
Okay, thanks.
Put a spotlight in the corner.
It's all right. No offense from it. Thanks, everybody. I just want to go ahead and first say to amend Ron's point that this is not a lecture. It's actually a lecture with beer, which is actually much better than the ones I usually give at school. So I want to back up a little bit and look at public art, but from a public artist perspective, and go back a few years. So if I can slow fade in here. This is an image I'll get to a little bit later, but this is from the high desert in West Texas at Big Bend National Park, which was a trip that I went on with some students, but I'll get to that in a bit. So I go back looking at artists from back 30, 40 years ago. So this is Richard Serra. When he came to New York in the late 60s, he came with a list. And it's pretty interesting when you look at this list and if you know his work, you'll know that this list embodies his work for 40 years that followed, right? And they were all actions, right? So the point of this is about action, which is what I want to talk about tonight. So if you look at this verb list, right, and this was actually a piece in a gallery, so it was an actual art piece for a gallery, but it also embodied what he wanted to do. So you can imagine him writing these things down and imagining all the things that he would do for the next 40 years of his career. But they're all acts, and they're also, his work, of course, really embodies physicality, right? Which is really pretty amazing. So I've looked at his work a lot. This is his early studio work, where his work was happening inside. So there are all of these physical acts in the gallery, working with lead, working with steel, working with various materials and kind of physical acts. And this was a statement from Richard Serra, which says, "My sculptures are not objects for the viewer to stop and stare at. The historical purpose of placing sculpture on a pedestal was to establish a separation between the sculpture and the viewer. I'm interested in creating behavioral space in which the viewer interacts with the sculpture in its context." So for Serra, site specificity and engagement drove the work, right? So it's a really important aspect of his work. So on the left here you see the sculpture in the public garden, George Washington on a pedestal. And then on the right, you see Tilted Arc by Richard Serra, installed in 1981, started in 1978. That work by Serra was commissioned by the GSA as part of the Art and Architecture program established in, I think, 63 or 67 with the National Endowment of the Arts. And it was part of the Art in Public Places program. So this was paid for through project money for federal buildings, right? So it was 0.5% was dedicated to art in front of these buildings. So if you know anything about this project, this work, it didn't last. The image on the left is from 1981. The image on the right is from 1989, when the work was taken down. A few months after his work went up, there was over 1,500 people signing petitions to take the work down. And then there was a 10-year battle about whether or not it was going to come down or not. So it was pretty interesting with Richard Serra. He argued that he was commissioned to design a public site-specific work. There was a proposal to move it. In fact, Storm King back in 1984 had agreed to actually take it. but then said no because Richard Serra put up such an argument that if you are going to ask me to design a site-specific work and then ask me to move it, you're essentially destroying the work, regardless of where it goes. So I think right now it's in some warehouse in Maryland in 3 pieces. Also, this is in the mid-70s, Gordon Meta Clark, who was trained as an architect and then quickly went into art after, spent much of his time doing work in existing buildings in New York. This is in Paris. Interventions. So Diller Scofidio, this is, to me, where it gets interesting because you can start to look at architects and see how they bridge art and architecture. Diller Scofidio came out of and began a practice in the late 70s, early 80s. The market wasn't good. They needed opportunities to build. And they, instead of waiting around for the phone to ring, they started doing their own work. Much of the work that they did started in galleries and then eventually found its way outside, like Richard Serra's work back in the early 70s. So this is Traffic, which was a takeover of Columbus Circle in New York for a 24-hour period with 2,500 parking cones. So here's a photograph of that work. So it's really trying to understand patterns, traffic patterns, movement patterns, how people begin to occupy space. In 1989, a project called Parasite, and the reason why I show this is because when you see the next project, you can see some correlations between the two. But this work, again, was a gallery work, and it was really set up, and what's interesting about Diller Scofidio is the work that they did at this earlier period really helped to shape what they were to do next when they got into architecture. So it was a means of investigation and thinking, right? So this was a way to work through ideas. So this particular project was connected to cameras that were located in the circulation areas within the gallery itself, within the gallery building. So there's this dialogue between, kind of voyeuristic dialogue between people moving through the space and the gallery itself. In this building, of course, we all know, which is nearby, the ICA. So again, similar themes that were happening 20 years ago are coming up in their work again, right? So the idea of voyeurism, observation, viewing, being seen, seeing, so on, are all sort of part of this work, but now it's at an architectural scale. So they used temporary work initially to start to discover what it was that they were trying to get at and determine their questions. So the work that I started doing about 6 years ago now was totally started on an impulse, and the impulse was just to make something. Like many architects, I think we all get a little bit tired of drawing and not making things. So the work that I've been doing, and I will say I constantly during this talk because I have a hard time actually figuring out who did what, because most of the work that I do is always collaborative. So there's probably about a quarter of the people in this room have probably worked on this stuff, so it's a little bit hard to say. But so I started with wanting to just make things, and the idea of temporary work became a way of doing that. So this was the very first thing that we did, which was up in Rockport, Massachusetts, where I'm from. And I figured it's a small town, who's going to ask, right? We can just maybe do something. So we bought 2,000 pounds of ice and made a few walls with it in the town. And we were lucky no one really asked until after we were done. The image...
What time of year was that?
This was February, yeah. So they managed to last. So these two pieces, these two walls had a certain orientation relative to the motif. If anyone has ever been to Rockport or coincidentally been in London and had a placemat on your table which actually has a motif in it, strangely enough, the image, it's a very iconic image. So each of these ice walls had an orientation to that motif, and embedded in the ice walls were an image from summer, from that same orientation facing in that direction. So you could sort of look through this ice wall and see the image of summer through it. Fortunately, it snowed that day, so we could actually move the ice. It turned out to be heavier than we thought. But this sort of engagement of making things physical is really important to us. It's really, we all benefit greatly from this and discover all kinds of compromises that we have to contend with. So here's the motif. So this is piece number 2, which has a certain orientation to another piece number 1 in downtown. And this was it after about 7 days. So what was interesting to us was the decay of the work over time, until eventually it collapsed. We won't get into liability for that. That's a different discussion. Second piece, again, was also in Rockport. This was a summer project, also dealt with the idea of memory and recall and sort of displacement of images. And this was a work that was interactive. So you can see a plan of the harbor here, a larger plan of the pier here, and there was a series of fabric panels that we're projecting on that were controlled by movement within the space. So people moving through it could actually start to affect the atmosphere of the space. So this is us installing it. So we were very interested in atmosphere with this project and trying to create a certain effect that was very ephemeral. So as much as we tried to control the wind blowing these fabric panels, we couldn't do it. In fact, it was the best part of the whole thing. We totally missed that until we got there. So taking this into school and into studio, I teach at Wentworth Institute of Technology, teach architecture there. And I had an opportunity to do a special topic studio in the 5th year master's program twice now. We've done this trip twice. So this was my provocation to the students, the idea of thinking big. And what the goal of the studio was to work collaboratively, build a large-scale project in response to a site visit, which we went on. So it was kind of a riff on the idea of not site, non-site with Robert Smith's idea from the early 70s. So it involved a juxtaposition of 2 places. One was New York, and one was the high desert of West Texas in Big Bend National Park. And then we followed up with a trip to Marfa, which is where Donald Judd's work is, and Chinati and all that kind of stuff. And again, none of these images are mine. They're all people sitting here. So these were part of the trip visits that we went. This, of course, is the High Line in very much of a detail. Again, the High Line. So here we are in West Texas, the largest national park in the country, and actually the second largest, but the most remote. It's about a 3.5-hour drive, and if you've lived in Texas, that's just a normal drive. But there's this basin that exists here that reaches an elevation of about 8,000 feet. So an absolutely amazing, very surreal place to visit. And to go from New York to a place like this, where the density goes from, I don't know what New York is, to density of about, everybody gets about 10 acres in this park. It's hard to take a bad picture of this place. It is America, you're right. It's amazing. Now we're in Judd's World in Marfa, Texas. If you haven't been there, I highly recommend it. So Donald Judd, interestingly enough, of course, was an artist in New York, and then he moved to Marfa. So he kind of migrated there over time, began by visiting West Texas, and then eventually started buying up property. And it supported his idea of permanent installation, which was the idea of making work but also housing the work in a very particular way. So he did not like the way that most museums dealt with his work, so he just took that job over and decided to make his own museum. So here are some images from that. And he also invited lots of artists, his collaborators and contemporaries at the time, to do work in that space. So here we are now at the final stage of this and actually getting the work done. So the idea of thinking big involves thinking big in terms of who you involve, and we had to partner, of course, and benefited from partnerships with many other people. One, of course, was Boston Society of Architects, who hosted the site for this project. And the second was Boston Properties, who helped shepherd the project through, as well as giving us a piece of land to build on. So the whole lesson that goes along with making something is a huge benefit for us as students and practitioners and professors. So all the work, of course, is done physically, using a combination of tools. So this was a lot of fabrication that led up to the work of the previous year. And these are some images of it. So this site was just next door here on the Harbor Walk a year ago. So the students did everything with this. We got it permitted, we got funding, we built it, and so on, everything from the ground up. It was a 3-month installation. So the next act, this past year, we went through the trip again and came out with a completely different outcome. And these are some, in fact, this gallery show, you can see this over in one of the conference spaces in the BSA space. So this project, I would say, is in mid-phase because we have not built it yet. But we will build it. But these are some images of it. So again, the students went through conceptualizing, testing, fabricating, prototyping, and detailing. The materials in this case were PVC and bent metal conduit to create a structure that you could then inhabit. So that's it. So just in closing, I would say that what's interesting me most about this topic is that we are poised to do things. Lots of people in this room want to do things. And I believe we are more capable than ever to do these because if you look at the way the practice is running or going now, we are involved in fabrication. We're involved in gallery work. We're becoming more and more generalists in many, many ways, even though those generalist activities might require some specialties. We are very poised to do this. So I'm very interested in maybe making small steps like this, but working towards a larger outcome. That's it.
I'm not sure the motive. Oh.
Yeah, while David's switching over, and just a question then for Rob, to think you don't have to answer now, which is small steps and small incremental steps. These pieces, they look like not small. And, but I think underlying what you're saying is incredibly powerful and also essential, because otherwise we're going to be paralyzed, or remain paralyzed. And so to think about how you translate what you were doing into something that is, well, sort of like what shows up on Figment, if you will, but something that is manageable, manipulable, fundable, and that also maybe gets everybody to think, I call it outside the box, which is a cliche, but I really, in this case, mean it, outside the physical box. And maybe it's more of a comment, obviously, than a question, but to think about how you make a transition from what you were doing to some other scale.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to take a risk here, and in an effort to make this less like a lecture than it has been so far, I'm going to start by polling the audience here. You raise your hands to tell me the questions that you have that I might be able to answer. I have a presentation prepared. It's sort of 4 war stories about 4 projects that Janet's done. But what I'm going to try to do is collect a bunch of questions and see if I can work the answers to those questions into the presentation that I have. So I'm going to wander over here to the whiteboard, and if anyone wants anything about Janet's work, public art that I might be able to answer, just raise your hands and ask away.
How does she deal with the weather, the wind, and the snow?
Weather, love it.
Yeah.
The back.
Did you have to build infrastructure for her work, or was that already there?
Infrastructure, great question. Just even further back.
What are we responsible
What's that?
What are we transforming?
What are we transforming? Give me more depth in that.
Oh, that's just a question.
What are we, okay, what are we transforming? Okay. Okay?
Did the kettle bowl dictate the design of the ark?
Aha, okay. Porto. The bowl, yes. In front.
Durability of materials and maintenance.
Aha, the old bugaboo.
Yeah.
I'm sure the T would take a look at Janet's work and say, ah!
Insurance.
Insurance, oh boy, yeah. It's so great because nobody ever asked about insurance. It's huge.
I would say entitlement process, like what was the permitting steps, or who did you have to work with?
Aha, permitting, yes. Okay.
Funding sources.
Money. Put that at the top. Yep.
Civic engagement and how that works.
Haha, civic engagement.
How do you deal with public perception?
You guys have great questions, by the way.
David, you're going to do this in 20 minutes?
Absolutely. We'll get to all of it. This is perfect. So this scene here, this is a scene of contented, successful project. This is the piece in Porto. It's Janet's second permanent work, but the first major permanent work in a big urban area. A couple of interesting things about this picture. This is not an intended public space. This is actually the inside of a traffic circle with no crosswalks across it. It's a 4-lane traffic rotary. People are not intended to go there, but it's such a nice place to be that they, play Frogger and get across the street and then go there anyway. The clicker thingy. We have the clicker thingy? Oh, there it is. Ah. Okay, so this is one of the engineering drawings of the project in Porto, and this gets a little bit to this question of maintenance, which comes from engineering. And even though Janet's work looks and is designed to look very, very soft and flexible and ephemeral, in fact, it's extremely carefully engineered. And in the case of this piece in Porto, Janet searched for 2 years to find the material for the net that would last for 15 years. And we were discussing with the group that was commissioning the work under what schedule they wanted to replace the net. Because as far as we know, we can't make a net that's going to last 100 years. It's an advantage of a sculpture made of, say, granite, that the durability of rock is better than the durability of fiber. But we were able to take that issue and find a compromise that works for everybody. I've always said to Janet about this particular project, I said, you'll know if we're successful not by exactly how many years the net lasts, but the first time that something goes wrong with it, how quickly do they move to repair it? That's the critical issue, because it's not terribly much money in the grand scheme of things for, first of all, this project or any of the repairs that might ever be necessary on it. It's a question of where it gets prioritized in the view of the project. So this is the video that has to play. So here it is at day and at night. To get into some of these questions here, so money. This particular project, the money came from the European Union. This was the last piece of structural adjustment money, which no longer exists in the EU, but at the time, Spain and Portugal joined the EU in 1986, and they got 20 years of structural adjustment money. So by 2005, when they were doing this, they had built the airports and the highways, and they were doing some urban renovation projects, and this piece of artwork is part of a big project they did to take the working waterfront of Porto and Matosinhos, its suburb to the north, and turn them into nice places to live and recreate as opposed to docks and factories. The permitting, in this particular case, you notice this thing is over, the cables go over a roadway. So originally the project was supposed to be just in that central grassy area. And then we said, well, we want to do this piece, but we need to put the support towers. There's 3 huge ones. One of them is like, I don't know, 20 stories or something. you can see, well, no, those are the street lights. We can't, you can see these cables. So it's over a public road. So to get the liability insurance for this, we had to form a joint venture with a Portuguese engineering firm that could buy the insurance that we needed, because there was no way that an American artist with no engineering certifications was going to be able to buy liability insurance in case that fell down over, over a traffic circle. So far so good. In terms of the sort of civic engagement here, so the group that actually commissioned the artwork was a committee composed of the sort of state government, the federal government, if you will, of Portugal, and the local municipality of Porto and Matosinhos. And the mayor of Matosinhos, who's sort of the most interested, because the sculptures were right on the border of this suburb. When Janet made her presentation in 2002, in January of 2002, he turns to the architect who's from the municipality, and he turns to him and he says, "What am I supposed to think of this?" Because he had no idea. I mean, this was just a drawing of that. And the architect was very supportive, and so the mayor was actually quite brave. And then the federal government changed to the other political party, who of course put the brakes on all of the projects that their political opponents had started, and this was one of them. So it sat in limbo for about 2 years, and then the government switched back, and the mayor of this little suburb of Matosinhos, even though it was had a background in art, was the one who stood up and pushed for the project and actually got it all the way back through, and that's why it's there. So there's your circle. There's no crosswalks on the traffic roundabout, but people go and love to hang out there. And you talk about civic engagement. So this is a poster for a soccer tournament held at their local stadium. And I don't know if you notice the design motif here, but it's Janet's sculpture. And you can sort of see it back there, but the soccer stadium has a big picture of the sculpture on it. And it's become a little bit of a civic icon for Matosinhos. And when they had to take it down the first time they had to repair the net, they put up these big, colorful graphics saying the Eckelmann sculpture is being fixed and it's going to be back in time for the summer festival. So that's a sign of, I feel good about the future of this work because it has an audience now. It has people who identify with it. So Phoenix. This is a section of downtown Phoenix that they condemned to create a park. So that was the big project in which one of the elements was a piece of public artwork. And around the time that Janet did her proposal, which looked like this, the financial crisis had struck. And even though the money for the park came from a bond issue that was also paying for the artwork, that had no impact on the town budget of Phoenix at all, they were in pain, right? Property tax revenues were plummeting, everyone was going broke, they were laying off teachers, they were laying off firefighters, and the city manager canceled the project. Mostly because he didn't want to be responsible for doing a big, huge public art project when they're laying off teachers and firefighters. And so the first group that had got engaged, there was an urban design and architecture and arts group downtown that stood up and said, no, you can't do this. First of all, it's not going to help the budget of Phoenix. And second of all, we really want this park to have a beautiful piece of artwork in the middle of it. And you've picked an artist and we've got a design in progress. And they actually got a public hearing done. And the director of the Phoenix Public Art Program called up Janet on a Wednesday and said, listen, I can't officially invite you out. We can't pay for it, but it would be really, really good if you were in Phoenix on Thursday. And because we're having a public hearing for the project. So Janet dutifully runs down to Logan Airport, hops on a plane, flies out to Phoenix. And she shows up in a big hearing room with the local media is there. There's people having little buttons on that are, I support the Eckelmann sculpture, and other people saying this is a huge waste of money, how the hell can we put art up? Others saying, I hate this piece, it's ugly, I don't want it in the middle of Phoenix. So a very tense environment, and I don't think in most artists' minds they think of standing up in front of that group and talking to them as part of their job description. But in fact, that's what Janet did, and she expressed what she was trying to do with the piece and why Phoenix might want it to continue. And then the public art program director got her meetings with each of the city councilors, one-on-one, and she described to them what she was attempting to do, and then they had another vote in the city council. and they affirmatively voted it in. And so we have, so this news story I love. Public installations have been raising hackles ever since that pesky Parthenon. Controversial sculptures had to rise in Phoenix. And then, I love the payoff graph here. Here's a simple test of the Phoenix City Council's wisdom in approving a giant steel sculpture that will float over a new downtown park. Does everybody like it? No. So here's the piece. It's called Her Secret is Patience. And it's got beautiful lighting. There's no light being emitted by the sculpture. That's all done by lights matched to the colors of the fibers that are projected from the ground. And here it is in the life of the city. So this is yoga under the sculpture. It's a favorite photograph for prom night.
Any Photoshop in that is really amazing.
No, there's no Photoshop in tonight's presentation. They have a movies under the sculpture program they do in the summer, and then that's a wedding picture under the sculpture. So it's helped.
How much do these things move around in the breeze?
It moves a fair amount. One of the big things that Janet wanted for this piece was that there's actually no structural elements between here, and I can use the laser pointer, between there and there. You notice there's the rings that hold it up, and then all of this is fabric, and so it can move a fair amount, and that is the intention. I had a question over there about infrastructure. So that is the infrastructure that holds these up. There's 3 of them, and if you want to know where a huge portion of the money in the project has to go, it's to build that and these giant steel rings. By the way, these are not round, and so the way we had them fabricated was a company that bends the tracks for roller coasters. We got them to bend this. Just last month, so this project is from 2009, just last month, Janet was invited to keynote at the International Conference of City Managers, which happens to be in Phoenix. And up on stage, she was introduced by the city manager who had canceled the project. And he stood up and he said, I'm here to say that I didn't like this project when it was going on, and I opposed it. And now I think it's the best thing that's ever happened to Phoenix, and I'm so glad that you guys were able to get this project done. So the political process was fully exercised, and the project survived. And then just a quick cultural note. This is an article from the Wall Street Journal from last week about airfares. So this is a symbol of Miami and Philadelphia, and of course Washington and the St. Louis Gateway Arch, and I guess that's the symbol of Chicago and Phoenix. So obviously, they're all, by the way, we looked at the photo credits. They're all from a stock photo agency. So obviously, I guess if you go to a stock photo agency and type in picture of Phoenix, you might get that. Somebody did. So let's see. So in terms of wind, so we had to find, so the guys in Porto said to us, well, how do we know how this thing is going to survive in a hurricane? Because we're on the Atlantic coast, we get hurricanes here, is it going to blow down? And we had to find a rare specimen, an aeronautical engineer who could help us do the calculations on this. And it turns out there's very few on planet Earth, but we found one. And have been working ever since then on increasing the sophistication of our ability to simulate the performance of these sculptures in wind. And in a couple slides from now, I will show you some software that we're collaborating on with Autodesk, which is also, they have an interest in what's called soft body deformation problems, and this is a problem in that group, to get even more information about how it's going to work in the wind. So this is a list of all the countries in the Americas because it comes from a art and culture festival called the Biennial of the Americas that asked Jan to do a project. And this is the project from 2010. And what I want to emphasize for this audience tonight is that you notice this is a piece that doesn't have a steel ring anywhere in it. It's instead got a structural net made of tensed aramid fibers that are very, very, very strong, and they're under tension from these things here. And then you can see the outline of the sculptural net hung from it. In terms of economics, in terms of infrastructure, this has had a huge impact on her work because oh well, the videos aren't playing, because we can, A, attach this to existing buildings. So the first building you saw this attached to was the Denver Art Museum, and then it was detached from the Denver Art Museum, and it was reattached. That is Sydney's City Hall. And this is the busiest intersection in Sydney, and it was reinstalled there. So it gave Janet's work an opportunity to travel and be temporary. And I love the remarks, Rob, that you were making about well, temporary work and also getting it built, because the temporary work really energizes the community and it gives them a chance to, if you will, build a constituency for possibly a permanent work. So the subway station is off to the left here. And these are people coming out of the subway station and encountering that hanging over the street. And so it's like right here. And it was like this, the sculpture was up for a couple of weeks and it was continuously, people are standing on the sidewalk. I love this guy here because he's talking to someone about the sculpture while he's photographing it. And then everyone's got their cell phone out taking a shot of the sculpture. It's pretty cool. And so here's, the big crowd there for quite a while. And then this is 1.26 in a third incarnation, which is over a canal in Amsterdam, actually the Amstel River right here in Amsterdam. Again, showing the capability you have when in this particular, you don't have infrastructure, you don't need to put up steel. This is much easier to install. We actually were talking to an engineer once about the tension that needs to be on these lines, and he's laughing. Isn't that's all you need? And, I could put this up anywhere.
So the lights are like down below, and it's the material that reflects?
Yeah, so the lights are here and there, and then another pair here and over there. So there's no, there's nothing on it that generates its own light. Now, talking about simulation and wind and software. So this is a piece of software that runs inside of Autodesk Maya. That's a plug-in being written by Autodesk and designed in collaboration with our studio, and we're running it. So this was an attempt to see if the software was going to work, so we programmed Porto into it. And the special thing about this software is that it knows how to do what's called soft body deformation. Turns out there's lots of software for telling you if a steel structure is going to fall over or not. There's a lot of software that'll tell you if fabric in tension is going to take the shape that you intended. But very, very little software is going to tell you if this collection of, say, 2 million knotted fibers is going to drape in the way that you intended it and how far it's going to move in a 20-mile-an-hour wind. So we're attempting to advance the state of the art in understanding that. This is an example of a new piece that Janet's working on, and she's designing it, and the shape that this takes isn't something that she sketched. It's all these parameters combined with, so you can see how many rows and how many columns of net and parameters about each one. And so you define all the different panels and all the different fibers, and the thing drapes. And then you can get a much better idea of what's going on. And here is downtown Vancouver, British Columbia. And Janet has been asked to do a sculpture here. The building that I'm hitting with the laser pointer is the one that we have permission to attach to its roof. And we'll be draping a sculpture, temporary one, from here over to the entrance of the Vancouver Convention Center. So the street that runs here, the entrance is kind of right here, but on the street level. And so the piece is going to drape across that street. Permitting and insurance. So obviously this goes across a big street here, and part of the reason that we're able to even conceive of this project is that the city of Vancouver was very, very helpful in saying, yes, we will get you the permission to do that, and we will find the right entities to buy the right insurance policies. It's helpful that Janet has 4 of these permanent works built and has had the temporary works, and we haven't had any problems with them, so the insurance companies are less freaked out than they were the first time they saw the very first one, and they said, what is that? And exactly what am I trying to insure against that? So that's also been helpful in getting funding, because Autodesk is actually sponsoring the sculpture along with the TED conference. So each of the 4 projects that I've talked about tonight got funded a different way. So Porto was EU money, Phoenix was a bond issue, 1.26 was temporary, so we paid for it. it was, by the way, what enabled Janet to come up with, somewhat serendipitously, this new structural system, which she's now contemplating to use in permanent work, because the fact that it's a lot less expensive is probably going to be super helpful in permanent situations as well, and you can put a lot more of the budget into other areas rather than erecting big steel infrastructure. And then the TED conference and Autodesk, it's sort of unique, and we're definitely happy to ride that wave. So let's see, did I get everything? Civic engagement, money, yes, weather. The piece in Vancouver I didn't talk about. There's another piece in Vancouver at the Olympic Ice Oval, which is way over here and then in the suburbs. It's designed so that in an ice storm, it will collapse in a very specific way, that the connectors to the ring will all break first, and so the net will be unharmed. So when there's an ice storm out there, we'll be able to recover from that. What are we transforming? It's a great question. I mean, in some ways, if we're really successful, a little piece of civic life, perhaps. The bowl in Porto was part of the design. Janet specified it. So the shape of the sculpture and the shape of the bowl are deliberately matched because that was what Janet intended. Maintenance, it's been a much better story than we had expected. We get this question every single project. How long will it last? The good news is the materials themselves are not terribly expensive, and so the oldest piece is the one in Porto, the second oldest is the one in Phoenix, and in both cases the maintenance budget has been well within our projections and not a big problem for either of the cities where the piece is located. Insurance, permitting, absolutely, and the public. I think the closest engagement we had with the public was definitely in Phoenix, and you get people who like it and people who don't, and it's kind of wonderful to see after a while the city adopt it as its own.
Great, thank you. A question for you too. By the way, one of the handouts, speaking about Vancouver, is something that Lillian Sue, my co-conspirator, who is here, head of public art for the city of Cambridge, brought to my attention that the city of Vancouver has a policy where in the private sector, any development that is zoned at 100,000 square feet or more has to have a certain dollar amount devoted to art and public spaces. This is in the private sector. This is not the usual percent for public art that one sees in many of the cities, although not here in Boston, in the US, and it's on the table out there. Rather than me guess on, I would really love to hear from you guys any questions, but questions maybe about the specific projects, but also what has this triggered in your minds about your own work, about the kinds of collaboration that might be more possible given what you've heard from Margie, from Rob, from Catherine, from David, just to sort of get some new, energies going around in this whole world of where urban design does meet art in public spaces. Anybody want to take a crack at that? Yes, sir.
What brings to mind is the timing and the collaboration. Boston Sculptors is setting up next week a 30 sculptures, a 20-year anniversary of Boston Sculptures, and it was just like me walking into the Christian Science Plaza thinking, wow, that is one of the best spaces in the city. And I remember the Tony Caro show in 1980, and I slowly worked my way up through the bureaucracy, talk to Tony, talk to Joe, and so it's going to be there for 6 months.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yeah, please.
I don't need to stand up on this. Right here.
Okay, it's just that he's recording.
Okay. An awful lot of the stuff the Janet does seems to require a lot of participation by engineering. How does the engineering go about it? Because I'm part of the same group, and I see things that people try to make, but they haven't got the material familiarity to make things actually hold up. I mean, it's a difficult set of questions. So, at what point does the engineering come into her work? Where does it start?
The short answer is it's really central. And Janet has a talk up on TED.com that tells the story of how she did her early work in collaboration with artisans, so batik masters and river fishermen and people who did fabric and people who did lace. And she viewed her work primarily through the lens of collaborating with an artisan. And then she got this permanent commission, and of course we were completely freaked out because we had no idea if you could build a permanent work, using the style that she had been exploring. And so we set out to find some engineers and fabricators who could do it, and the discovery that was so wonderful is that it was as meaningful for her to collaborate with engineers and fabricators as it had been to collaborate with artisans. She used exactly the same style, which is to say, it's like a tool palette. And she jumps in and brings the engineers and the fabricators in really early and takes their feedback into her artistic objectives. So it's very infrequently that she goes to an engineer and says, this is what I want, can we build it? And it's always, let's talk about the infrastructure. I mean, a simple example is the piece in Porto. It has, the main ring over there has, presentation is so good you can see it twice. Okay, maybe in this piece we can see it. You see the sort of stays in the center of the ring. So the engineers came back and said, well, the diameter of this ring, of this tube, is going to have to be so enormous to resist the torque of just being suspended in space there, that how do you put the spokes in here and that'll allow us to stabilize it? And she thought, I don't really want spokes. And then what she decided is it would be okay as long as this wasn't exactly in the center. So in fact, if you go look at this, you might not notice it the first time you go to the artwork, but in fact, the spokes all join in a spot that's not exactly in the middle of the wheel, and so it's actually got a little bit of interest on its own. And also, the work with the engineers about the structure, this is actually two nets. There's a structural net and an artistic net hung from it, and designing the interfaces on all these places ended up using nautical lore, so learning how to whip the nets together. So it's a real collaboration, and it's really central. And also, we're learning as we go along. There have been issues that have come up and been solved in a couple of the projects that she's done, but it's front and center, which is why this collaboration with Autodesk is now moving to the next level of let's go work with the software engineers and get a tool. The primary motivation for Janet is she wants to build even bigger work. And the engineers from Vancouver just came back last week and said, Janet, the load on this sculpture is 40x the load on the last sculpture we worked on with you. And she's like, okay, great. What does that mean? How we have to respond to that? But she's very, very capable of keeping her artistic goal in mind and just rolling with the punches in terms of what the materials and the structural realities are.
Yes, sir.
What criteria does she use to decide what type of space one of her works could go in, could fit well in, so that it draws the requisite attention onto itself, but does not obstruct buildings or other objects in any unreasonable way?
Another great question. So this piece here, you can see it's in front of some apartment buildings. And there was a lot of concern when the project was underway that it was going to block the oceanfront view of these buildings, which obviously is not okay. But the design brief also said they wanted a really iconic sculpture that you could see from a kilometer in any direction. So just make it visible from a kilometer away, but don't interfere with the ocean view. And as it turned out, this kind of fit the bill. She's very much site-specific in her orientation, so when someone calls her up and says, hey, can you do a sculpture here? The main response is, okay, I have to go there, I have to stand there, I have to sit there for a while, I have to watch people move through the space, and she sketches almost compulsively. I mean, there's sketchbooks all over the house. She's always sort of taking her ideas and recording them and eventually coming up with a sculpture that she thinks answers the right question. I'm always amazed in watching her engage with the groups that are commissioning sculptures. That probably the most important thing that she does when she comes into a project is the site. They've said, well, we're trying to address problems X, Y, and Z. And she'll come back and say, it's interesting, but what about A, B, and C instead? And they'll say, in many cases, wow, you're right. Why don't we go address A, B, and C instead? And so that's as much a part of the artistic process as actually describing a form and a method to put it up.
Yeah, I'm going to use my prerogative, and I'd like to sort of shift the scale of this conversation a little bit. And thinking about what Margie and Catherine were talking about, and also Rob, and also, you know, your focus and Janet's focus on collaboration, I was so struck, and I said this earlier, about your working with youth groups. At the same time, saying that, no, we don't go out, the groups have to come to you. And Rob talking about this kind of spontaneous intervention, to use the phrase that was used at the Architecture Biennale last year. And I'm wondering, I mean, any thoughts occurred to folks about how this can all happen? Who can go to Margie and to the T, thinking about the kind of work that Rob was talking about, and also the kind of collaboration that David represented? I mean, I was struck by the mayor. What in the world got him to suddenly switch? And you don't have to answer that, but I think that's important, and to try to, it's not magic. I don't know what it is, but anyway, so that's, yeah.
Well, yeah, similar question. Like Rob talked about site-specific interventions.
And so I'm curious. So how does the MBTA go ahead and select an artist? Is there a committee that commissions one, or is there an RFP? And then in the case of Janet's work, over the course of her career, how did she break into public art, basically starting from nowhere? And at one point, did she start getting commissions from private developers or whatever?
Or you want to take that?
Sure. The answer has to do with then and now. I mean, then when there was funding for an art program, you know, there was a public process. You know, the art's on the line. There was a request for artist submissions of slides. We'd poured over the slides, you know, selected artists that were appropriate for the stations, you know, et cetera. At the moment, you know, there is really no program except what we can get away with. And we sneak it in whenever we can. But going forward on the Green Line extension, assuming that we get enough money to build the Green Line extension, you know, there will need to be, you know, a public process, and there would be, you know, an open call to artists.
Catherine?
But on the other hand, there's also the temporary art program, which is mostly the youth programs that come to us. It's usually groups, and we do go through a committee process, which is internal, which involves safety, marketing, communications, design and construction, engineering, everybody who weighs in who has something to do with that space that this particular group might be proposing. But you asked a question earlier, I just want to address it really quickly about the creative process. And back in the day when it was Jackson Square, the 4-year program, I kind of was the go-between with what's acceptable for public art and what the kids really wanted to create. And it was most of the time fine because they had a director at the time who was reining them in. But there was a few images that sometimes were questionable, and that's when I would go back and just kind of negotiate with these kids. It was an interesting process, but we didn't have this temporary art program at the time, but it was really the beginning of it, and we kind of saw we better do something because this could get out of hand. So we did something, and that was kind of solved that issue. Because, you know, some of the imagery that some of the people come up with who aren't really sophisticated artists can be, kind of go against their message almost. And instead of saying we're for peace, it looks like they're for war, you know, depending on what their imagery is. So, you know, we have to be very careful with that as well. But we don't want to stifle them either, so it's kind of a nice balancing act, but it makes it interesting as well.
Rob, do you want to say
But I wanted to note a couple of things, Rob, that you mentioned that are totally consistent with what's happened in Janet's career. One is the influence of Gordon Motta Clark on art in public places is huge, and Janet lists Gordon Motta Clark as a very strong influence on her stuff. Also, temporary work as a way to engage with the civic, with the community writ large can be very, very, very powerful. I think people have a reasonable concern and apprehension about a major piece of art being placed in the middle of the urban context. I mean, it becomes part of the city, but what if it's really ugly? And in Phoenix, for example, they had done a project in the mid-'80s which had not been well received at all. The reaction was uniformly negative, and basically there were no big public art projects in Phoenix for 20 years. And the head of the Phoenix Public Art Program said at the beginning of the project that led to Her Secret is Patience, he said, if we screw this up, we're done. Like, if this project is not successful, they're just gonna shut down the program and never, you know, it'll be another 30 years before anyone tries any art here in Phoenix. So we are very respectful of the terrible, powerful constraints operating on the commissioning side of these art projects, where in addition to funding issues and permitting issues and insurance issues, you also have the question of what if it's not popular? What if everyone hates it? And you know, and there's a political process that causes me to lose my job because everyone's mad that there's this artwork that nobody likes in the middle of the city. So you know, I respect that it's a risky political process. And in the case of Phoenix, what got the project done was that in addition to the urban design and architecture community downtown, the business coalition said, we think this is a good idea. We think that downtown as a destination and downtown as having a livelier urban life is worthwhile and good. And so they essentially said, we're in favor of this. And my opinion is it's those two groups acting together that enabled the city councilors to decide that it was politically okay to vote affirmatively for the project in that final vote.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that because one of the things that I and some colleagues are trying to do, and we've already had conversations about it, is to get together with the downtown bid in Boston for precisely that reason. They're in the middle now of going through design guidelines, and this is an absolutely opportune time to incorporate issues around art in public places within those guidelines. And as I said, we've talked to folks at the bid. I also know one of the planners, Kaki Martin, who's working on this. So I'm hoping that this would get to what David has been talking about, not on as grand a scale perhaps as in Phoenix, but nevertheless it's hugely important. Jason, you had something? Yeah.
So, hi, I'm Jason. I do things in Boston, and I'm going to beg permission, as I do when I stand up in front of crowds, to sell you something at the end of the night, but I'm not going to sell you that now, because it'd be rude. But listening to all this talk about art in public places and the struggles of the T financially and temporary art, and the previous conversations we've had privately and in public forums about can we make public art platforms in places, it seems to me that there's a tremendous opportunity at the T to do things that cost almost nothing, which is to create spaces where you can put art later, but you've got the infrastructure, the basics, electricity, running water, a viewing platform, some sort of, you know, a welded metal ring on the roof that you could eventually hang one of Giant's things from, just things that cost nothing, not a 1%, but a 1/10 of 1% or a 1/100th of 1% by just designing the stations properly. And if you're gonna run a train line through what is acknowledged as being probably the most artistic line, the artistic city in the country at the moment, which is Somerville, and not make allowances for public art, then we've kind of completely lost everything that we're talking about in this room. So I don't know if there's a response to that, but is there any possibility of doing something to make it easier to make temporary public art later?
I don't know if I have an answer to your question, but I will say that I think a really brilliant thing that's being proposed here, and it sounds like you're doing this already, is the idea of embedding work directly into the project itself, right? So that many of us in this room have probably been involved in value engineering discussions, and where something would disappear in a moment if it's not embedded into the project. So I think the idea of doing that, so give me a chance to design some formwork, I would love to do that. But it's what a great thing, right? I mean, because you can't get rid of it, right? I mean, that's a brilliant thing. But I do think that the idea of, at the same time, if you don't have the money to do the whole thing, you build the infrastructure, or at least you design the infrastructure into the project, right? So again, you're not adding anything, your only thing you're adding is consideration, right, at the beginning.
I'm going to put you on the spot. Is that in the realm of reason, what Rob has described?
Well, you know, we are by definition infrastructure. So we have the infrastructure, and the piece needs to be appropriate to the infrastructure. So we have what's needed. We don't need to add anything more, because how are we going to imagine what it's going to be? We could design for one thing and put some hooks or rings or whatever up, and somebody will propose something different. But, you know, given that we have the infrastructure, many things will be possible.
So I would just summarize that as work answering a need. I remember, I think it was Palace Lombardi said, where does this artwork answer a need? Ron, you gave an example of the George Washington sculpture, which was put up by public subscription. So citizens all over the country paid for it. Top down was the Richard Serra Tilted Arc. You know, the committee in Washington made the decision, and it offended people. So always asking the question, is it necessary? But also, I think we have to try to get the 1% back as a part of the infrastructure of the city.
Shona?
Well, I wanted to sort of back up a lot, and actually, part of this question is directed to you, Ron, and I would like to try to define what is this hunger for public art specifically, and why? Because I think trying to define I think that, you know, from the people in the room, there is a hunger for public art, and there's a hunger in the public. But what is that hunger? What need is it satisfying exactly? And I'd love to hear your opinion, but I'd also like to hear other people's as well.
I cannot conceive of a way to give a single response to that, because it would be my need. My need is to be in a place or surrounded by, within a place that, I use these, you know, $10 words called exuberance, called robustness, called energy, called the kind of stuff that Janet's work really it compels.
Wonderful.
Well, yeah, it's all of those adjectives, and I hate to say it, there's a cheap answer, which is I know it when I see it. And I think everybody here, in a way, kind of knows it when they see it, which is why they're here, which is why they're in the room. And just as Rob showed that list that Sarah's list? Had made all of those action verbs, that was like 100 of them. And there might be 70 people in the room, we would have 140 of those action verbs, and then collecting those, maybe begins to get at something that could be summarized. But, when the first time I never knew Janet. Steve Wolf, who was still in the room, there he is, was a colleague of mine at Goody Clancy, and he told me about a presentation she was doing at the Boston Public Library. I'd never heard of her. And we went there, I think about 4 or 5 years ago, and she presented the Phoenix Project, and it just blew me away. Why did it blow me away? I don't know. It just did. And I think a lot of what we see, whether it's Rob's work out here on Harbor Walk, or whether it's what Margie and her staff did with Arts on the Line, it's sort of inchoate, unfortunately. And in a way, I think it's fortunate that it's inchoate.
Hi, I'm going to start with the sublime question, what is the hunger for public art? And I'm just, because it is different for everybody and because it changes all the time, the idea of ephemeral public art is especially appealing. And so I'm going to take it to the mundane, because if we have this yearning for art, and we have budgetary constraints, and we have changing tastes, and we have a lack of will, frankly, in a lot of quarters to commit to create a lot of permanent public art, we have a desire for ephemeral art, then we do need to have the will to commit to, back to the question of the infrastructure. And I was a little confused by your answer, because are you saying the T is the infrastructure, or that you are going to have concrete pads and anchorage and lighting and electricity? I think we have to get down to the nuts and bolts. There are probably many planners and architects in here as well as artists, and how are you going to build it is always the question. And if we don't have an it yet, how are we going to provide the facilities in situ? And when we have an opportunity like the T expansion, how do we get that infrastructure specifically for temporary art and permanent art? Those pads could become permanent art places later. How do we get that built so that we really can get this movement rolling? Because we have to start somewhere.
Before I give it to Margaret, did you want to respond? Sure. Okay, but before I give it to you to respond, I suddenly had this idea based on your comment. If this were a university and this were a class, your assignment, all of your assignments, would be to define for yourselves, or for everybody else, your notion of public art. And getting back to the same questions that were posed at that roundtable back in October, what's the art, who's the public, what do we have, what do we need, and how do we get it? Because those 5 questions collectively, I think, would come up with some answers to, I think what you were saying, and would maybe suggest to let's say the T, to examine, well, how can infrastructure play a role, however, generic at the early stages, play a role in supporting whatever we will wind up calling art in public places. And I guess I'm more than just a little bit fatuous. I'm sort of half serious. You have my contact information on the bottom of the agenda. If you guys, any of you, could really do that exercise to think about, what is the art, who is the public, what do we have, what do we need, and how do we get it? It could be nothing more than 5 sentences. Man, that would be phenomenal. And I think collectively would begin to perhaps describe what is going on in the city as represented by this rather extraordinary collection of people who are here. Morgan, do you want?
Yeah, my name is sculpture of those lobsters up above, but you'll notice it hasn't been repainted for a long time. So I think we can talk about public art in a very amorphous way, but I'm really curious about what's the impact for local communities, what's the direct financial impact of the artwork. And I know that the Pear in Dorchester is featured on every Dorchester real estate publication, that people in that neighborhood who wanted to move away once the piece was built suddenly said, this is a neighborhood of standing, I want to stay here. It's become a signal of pride for that community. And I think artists are incredible problem solvers, as you said, Janet, was, where people kind of come in and say, can you solve this scrappy little street? We want a piece of public art here. And the artist comes in and says, actually, let's talk about A, B, and C, which will also potentially address E and F. So I think artists are incredible problem solvers, and I think artists create an incredible sense of place within the work that they do. And I think we have fabulous examples of that in downtown Chicago. I mean, they're very concrete examples about what the efficacy of public art is. And I think that it's creating language for that that's really formalized and not and concrete and not kind of amorphous, what does it do for us, but what is the money that brings into communities? How is the red line a different experience than riding on the green line? Well, you can point to the work that came from the Art on the Line and talk about how that work is endemic of those communities and of those key stops. So I actually think we have words. And I think those words are like 2x4s that need to be nailed together to create a signpost that says this is of value. And let's look at these projects in fabulous cities, other places, and say Boston is fabulous. I mean, as we've been learning the last couple days. And say Boston is a community where for very little money, incredible landmarks can be made, and you can utilize all the energy of those great Somerville artists to talk about place, to create work that isn't Dunkin' Donuts generic, but is really specific to place and makes this community shine in the way the hospitals make this community shine, in the way that all of these civic events in Boston, let's have artwork be part of that, because it can be, because we have examples of it in the city small, but we have fabulous examples in other places. So, I mean, I think this is, I think that Ron's been fabulous to bring this group of incredible people together, and I think to make these connections, because I think for short change, huge things can happen.
Amen.
It's 5 minutes past our sell-by date. All right, one more comment, and then we're going to have to blow this pop stand.
Well, one question is, this has been primarily about public art out in parks. What about public art in public buildings, like the Sargent murals of the public library? comments?
No, I mean, other than they're beautiful.
Is that a topic for another meeting rather than?
No, it's a good point you make, because we make certain assumptions when we're talking about public art as out in the public space. Yeah, no, I understand that, but somehow there's a difference between, and this is, I speak to you, by the way, not as an artist or as a curator. I'm not. I sort of live here. I'm a planner and publisher, whatever. But to me, I think about public art as outside. I know there's a whole category that we're avoiding and not considering, and maybe for another session we should do that. Okay, Jason, you're it.
Can I sell my tickets?
I guess.
I'm known for making a pest of myself. If you had fun tonight with 4 bottles of wine and some slideshows, you should come to Figment, which Ron plugged a number of times over the night. We're having our fundraiser in Waltham at the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation, which none of you have ever been to, and all of you will regret as soon as you walk in, never having gone before. We have 300 tickets to sell in 6 weeks, and we are filling it up with the artists who make Figment happen in July, and your $35 ticket will make Figment happen in July because we get 0 public funding. So please be one of the 300.
We have a website?
We do, figmentproject.org.
Okay, David Gamble informs me that, was it Lillian?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, you have
Last word.
Last word.
Thank you, Dave. Well, I wanted to answer Sean's question very briefly, and I feel like the why is really for people to connect with each other and to connect with place. And to me, that's just the very simple answer. And I think that art isn't the only thing that can do that, but I think that, so we have architects and landscape architects here, designers. I think we all have a unique place to make that happen. I mean, the Boston Marathon was about connecting to each other and connecting to place. And so that also speaks to the integration and embedding art with design, whether it's landscape or architecture, is something we struggle with all the time. How can we get there early? How can we get it embedded? It's a struggle every day, but that really is, we all bring something unique. Public art isn't the only thing, but it has a unique place, and it's really about that connection.
Would you record that? Sure. I just want to make one pitch, or say one more thing, actually, in connection with Margie again. In early May, I'm going to a meeting of what's called the Boston Committee. The Boston Committee consists of representatives from the local area community development corporations. We've been working with the Mass Association of CDCs, and the Boston Committee, which represents JP and Mattapan and whatever, is a very, very important aspect of the civic life in Boston. And what I couldn't help but think about is speaking at the committee, not only about what Boston App Lab is about, but trying to somehow easily or subtly explore opportunities for those CDCs to work jointly with the T. Somehow, I don't know what that looks like, but to forge a relationship or a series of relationships with the T and those CDCs that are possibly on the line, maybe they're not necessarily on the line, but as another partner, another cluster of partners, for the T. Just a thought. I said that the last bit of this was going to be what have we learned and what are we going to do about it. We have run out of time, but getting back to my assignment, if you guys could think about that, what have we learned, but mostly what are we going to do about it? And again, just jot down some notes and email them to me at ron.malice@gmail.com. This would be great. For everybody who signed in, and I hope everybody did sign in, you'll be getting notes from this, and then if we do have anything that comes out of this last assignment, we'll definitely get it off to you, and that will also get incorporated eventually onto our website, bostonapp.org, which is, we have right now a searchable database of about 140 names. The website needs an awful lot of help and is getting some currently. But that's the kind of material that will be a key part of the website. I want to thank everybody here who's sitting at this table. Great job. Thank you. And I want to thank everybody who's stopping for coming here tonight. This has been extraordinary. We're still working on the next couple of sessions for Boston App Lab, one topic of which is looking at art in public places from the developer's perspective. And something that Rob said regarding Boston properties triggered something in my mind that I think I need to talk to you about them. The other is, again, as I said earlier, the downtown bid and the incorporation of design standards with concepts or approaches to art in public places. And then there's a whole variety of activities going forward. If you have any questions, any second or third thoughts, please get them to me. They don't have to be answers to the questions. They just can be, your mad musings. Thanks again for coming.